Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the wonderful people at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association, and the Australasian bit has never been more apt because we have recently had a new president or a new chair appointed to ASA, and I am pleased to announce that it's Philip Armstrong from New Zealand. And I'm also very pleased to be able to announce that the next ASA conference, which will be held in 2019, will in fact also be held in New Zealand. So it's the Australasian Animal Studies Association with a very big New Zealand presence. They sponsor this podcast. If you're not a member of ASA, you should be. You can have a look for them just by searching the name on Google, or also follow them on their Facebook page. On their Facebook page, they post a lot of interesting items about upcoming jobs, upcoming conferences, calls for paper, etc. So that's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. So this episode, like the last few in the series, is coming to you from the 2017 ASA conference, which is being held at the University of Adelaide. It's a beautiful sunny day outside in the City of Churches, and I'm joined by one of the very special international guests who I wouldn't normally have the chance to interview. So I'm very lucky to be joined by Dr. Charlotte Carrington-Farmer. Charlotte is Assistant Professor in the Department of History at Roger Williams University, which is in the United States of America. And today we're going to be discussing her book chapter, Trading Horses in the 18th Century, Rhode Island and the Atlantic World, which will appear in the book Equine Cultures, Horses, Human Society and the Discourse of Modernity, 1700 to the present. And that book will be available soon, hopefully. It'll come out in 2017 and it will be available via the University of Chicago Press. Welcome to the podcast, Charlotte.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Charlotte, can you start by telling us what inspired you to write this chapter?
It's a really strange story. It came about because I actually flew my own horse from England to New England. So my horse, Cara, which is actually a pony, she got on the horse box in Derbyshire in England, went all the way across the Channel Tunnel to France, to Belgium, and then got on a plane in Liège in Belgium and flew from Belgium to JFK, was in quarantine for a couple of days there, and then another month of quarantine in Rhode Island. And this was a very expensive, scary process, and it got me thinking about moving horses back in the 17th and 18th century. So my special field is early American history, with also a focus on the early modern Atlantic world. So it seemed to make sense to look at moving horses in the 17th century. So it came about because I moved my own horse, and it got me interested in how did they used to do that before they got on planes.
Yes. So how did they move horses?
It was horrific, is the honest answer. So the horses that I'm really interested in are the ones that were loaded in Rhode Island, also in neighboring Massachusetts and Connecticut, so the east coast of America in New England, that were then loaded on ships and sent to the sugar colonies, both the British, French and Dutch colonies, both in South America and the Caribbean. And the horses were transported there to work on the sugar plantations to crush the sugar. The horses travelled on the ships. They were deck cargo. So there are horrific cases that make it into the local newspapers on all corners of the Atlantic, describing how horses were drowned because they were tethered, how they were swept out to sea. Horses travelled as deck cargo back in the 17th and 18th century.
Now, I've been lucky enough to both read your book chapter in advance and also hear you speak on the topic. So I understand that they were a very sought after resource for the plantations. Can you tell us a little bit about why they were so valuable?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons. So the plantations in the sugar colony needed horses for two purposes primarily. The first purpose was for planters and overseers to ride around the big plantations, to go and visit crop, to go and visit neighbouring plantations. And so riding horses were typically the Rhode Island breed, the Narragansett Pacer, that were very expensive, very well looked after. The breed which came about at some point during the 17th century, which was then extinct by the mid-19th century. So they're used for riding purposes. The second reason why horses were needed in the sugar colonies, which was the most important purpose, which was for draft work, to crush the sugar on the cane crushing mills. These horses had a very different life when they got to the sugar colonies to the riding horses. Life expectancy was probably a year or two. Plantations got through several teams of horses every year. So there's a real hierarchy in the type of horses and the job that they did in the sugar plantations.
So why would some horses be chosen for one kind of activity and some for another?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Rhode Island develops this breed, the Narragansett Pacer, that is for the riding. What makes them so special is that they're a natural pacer. And with the Narragansett Pacer in particular, the movement of the backbone makes them so special. So when a regular horse trots, its front right will be forward and its back right will be, and then it'll swing. The Narragansett Pacer, when it paces, the front right is forward and the back right is forward. So through this smooth movement, you could cover over 100 miles a day without the horse tiring and most importantly, perhaps without the rider tiring. So that's what makes those particular horses so valuable. The horses that are going to crush the sugar, they'll take whatever they can. Those horses are going to die. They're often the Rhode Island account books that I've read, you might pay £5-10 for one of those horses and maybe sell it on for 50, maybe £20. And you know that those horses are going to die. So they're not such a big investment. They're easily replaceable. So those horses could be anything. We have no record of what kind of horses they are. What we do see in the newspaper ads in New England is that they're looking for smaller horses. And that's because they needed to be small enough to fit into the cane crushing mill.
So you were saying that in many ways the way in which the horses were bartered was very similar to the way in which the human slaves were also bought and sold. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about some of the parallels you see in that commodity, those two commodities?
Yeah, absolutely. So I envision in the next year or so, when I've finished off this research, that I've got a book chapter coming out, I've got an article coming out, I'll then have a whole book to write, and I think that title is probably going to be something like Slave Horse, New England and the Atlantic World. So I'm really interested in this connection between slavery and the slave trade, horses and the sugar. So the story of horses and humans starts in New England. One of the great myths of American history is that slavery and slaves are only in the South. That's not true at all. New England, Rhode Island in particular, is one of the leading slave trading ports in all of the world at this time. There are also slaves that live in Rhode Island, and there are plantations in Rhode Island, not necessarily cash crops like sugar or tobacco or cotton, but plantations that produce horses, that produce cheese, that have livestock, and slaves play a huge part in raising those animals and making those products. So slaves are most likely the ones that help to breed and raise these horses in New England. Then the next link, I guess, with enslaved people is that merchants just regularly traded horses for humans. I read a series of letters in the John Carter Brown archives at Brown University in Providence merchants are, I'll give you 5 horses for, and I'm quoting here, 1 Negro girl. So horses and humans are interchangeable, as is things like you see horses being traded for molasses and sugar and rum. And then the next kind of missing piece of the puzzle is to look at what happens to the horses and the humans when they get to the sugar colonies. The horses toiled alongside the slaves, crushing the sugar. Just like the slaves, they could be bought and sold at will. And in some cases, slaves only got meat when the horses or other livestock died. So it seems to me that every step of the way, humans and enslaved chattel property, that their lives really do mirror. You also see it in the newspaper descriptions, either describing slaves that have run away or horses that have been stolen, or estate inventories that are listing slaves and horses for sale. The language is eerily similar. Both horses and humans are described routinely as being strong, well-bred, a good hard worker. So the language is eerily similar that's used to describe these two pieces of property.
Now, the story you tell is also an extinction story, so it is a breed of horse that is no longer with us. Can you tell us about why this animal hasn't continued on?
Yeah, so the Narragansett Pacer is a Rhode Island myth. So when I moved from England to Rhode Island a few years ago, everyone had these stories of the Narragansett Pacer. One of them is that Paul Revere rode one in his midnight ride, and I quickly proved that wasn't true. He puts his horse to a gallop, it's not the right height. So it's shrouded in this kind of mystery cloud, and one of the mysteries is why did it become extinct? And I think through my research, I've got a couple of answers to that question. I think the first reason is that it's no longer useful by the mid-19th century. What makes this horse so special is that it's great for riding. It can cover, hundreds of miles a day with a rider. But by the mid-19th century, most people are traveling by coach, and this horse is not a coach horse. So you see this again a lot in the newspaper ads, that they're looking for horses that can both pace but also can trot, a more versatile horse, and this isn't one of them. The second reason why this horse becomes extinct is through crossbreeding. Again, reading through a lot of the farmers' cabinet meetings and the agricultural society meetings, I would say, the late 1770s, 1780s, they're aware that this horse breed is dying out, mainly through crossbreeding. They talk at length of crossbreeding with the Arabian horse. The other reason is when slavery is abolished throughout the Atlantic world in the 19th century, horses aren't necessarily needed in the sugar colonies in the way that they were for, the past 100 or 200 years. I think the other reason is that these horses, even when they're at the height of their popularity, in the mid-18th century, they're described as villainously ugly by many people. So it's not as though this horse is, something that you would want to show off to people. It's a useful horse, and that's it. And in New England, as more people start living there, there's not the spare grazing for these horses. So I think it's because, the sugar colonies don't have that need. The roads change, and New England itself, the landscape changes.
Wonderful. So, Charlotte, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am.
So, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
So, I am so new to animal studies. This is actually my first animal studies conference.
Right.
And this is the first animal kind of history piece that I've written. My PhD was on crime and dissent in 17th century New England. So I came to this backwards. I read all of the 17th century, 18th century primary sources on horses, like diaries, letters, account books, shipping records, horse care manuals, court records, parliamentary records. Then I started to delve into horse-specific secondary books. So it was only then, at that point, that I realized that I was engaging with this new to me discipline of animal studies. So I then kind of went backwards and I read Paul Waldo's Animal Studies and Introduction, which came out in 2013 with Oxford University Press. And so I came very much backwards to it.
Well, there's a book that you might like called The Dreaded Comparison. Have you come across that one? So I can't think of the author's name, but it compares historical writings about slaves and about non-human animals, including quite contemporary writings as well. And one of the central themes is how similar the language is used to describe the two. So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, this is the first piece of animal scholarship full stop that I've written. And as I say, this is my first animal studies conference, but the conference has been fabulous. The reception to my work has been very encouraging. So I look forward, I guess, in the future to engaging further with the discipline is what I'd say to that question.
Yes. So the next question might be a little bit tricky, but perhaps you've come across someone at this conference even in the last few days. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Yeah, I honestly, I'm struggling to answer that question. What I would say is from the literature that I've read building up to this project, I read a lot of Alfred Crosby's work that described, in detail about how animals snorted and stomped and whinnied and barred and made their way into what he termed the Columbian Exchange. So I think that mindset really affected my work. Specifically, Peter Edwards, I don't know if you know him, he's a scholar from the UK, and he's written 2 really important books that look at horses in early modern England. And again, they really shaped the way that I started to think and write about horses. But I'm sure as I do more animal studies, that answer will change.
So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
So speaking from my discipline as a historian, I think it's really important to look at animals in the past because it really makes us think about what's going on today. There was an interesting trend in my field of early American history and early modern history to look at things in the Atlantic world. So slaves, sugar, tobacco, chocolate. And a big trend right now, which is great for us, is to look at animals in the early modern Atlantic world. I was part of a panel at the John Carter Brown Library a couple of months ago now that was entitled The Early Modern Menagerie. And scholars such as myself, I presented on horses, but other scholars were working on turtles, hummingbirds. So I think in history, it's a big trend now. So I think being aware of that, I think to answer your question as best as I can, I think the most important thing is for scholars to research animals and also to write about them historically and contemporarily.
So, Charlotte, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. I don't know how your guests answer that. I guess trying to be more aware of how animals think and how they feel. I'm really interested in trying to raise awareness of empathy in animals.
Yeah, wonderful. So what are you working on next?
Okay. Well, this chapter, as you said, is coming out later this year. I've done most of the archival work for the Big Book Project. This summer, I've got to go back to Massachusetts Historical Society and Connecticut Historical Society, and then I've got the National Archives to go to in Kew in London. So when all of that's done, I'm going to be presenting at the American Historical Association conference in DC in January. Again, really exciting for animal studies. There's a whole panel on animals in the early modern Atlantic world. So I'm going to be preparing for that. And so, yeah, the idea is in a couple of years, the book will be out, tentatively titled Slave Horse, New England and the Atlantic World.
Wonderful. And how can people find out more about your work?
Sure. They can either look me up on my university page. So I work at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island on the east coast of America. So they can just type in Charlotte Carrington-Farmer, Roger Williams, and my page will come up. Or I'd love to hear from people via email. My email is slightly long, so I'll just quickly say it. It's carrington-farmer@rwu.edu. So CCARRINGTON and then a hyphen FARMER@rwu.edu.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Charlotte, for joining us, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, as always, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at @knowing_animals, or you can like us on Facebook at Knowing Animals. Finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. iTunes reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.